Plugin of the week is the Waves H Reverb. The H Reverb is an interesting kind of plugin. It kind of encompasses something that is a hybrid between impulse response libraries, where you're dealing with actual samples of acoustic spaces, and the way that you would operate most natural plugins, where you can really get into detailed control over all of the parameters. Where you're primarily dealing with a delay-based engine, and then you're kind of morphing all of those different things into different sounds. What Waves has done is a hybrid of that, hence the H Reverb. If you're familiar with the HEQ utilizes many of the technologies of analog components put into a single EQ. The H delay hybridizes a lot of the characteristics of vintage compressors into a modern compressor setting. And the H delay, which takes a lot of analog style vintage processing and implements it into a modern interface. So the H Reverb is something very similar. The way to kind of look at this plugin, because I have a video on the Waves YouTube channel, which is extraordinarily long. It's 54 minutes long, that just deals with the insane detail and all the different things. And in that video, I think I go through, 10 or 12 or 15 different examples of all different kinds of reverbs and way to use all the individual sections. And I think if you're looking for a really detailed thing, that's the place to go for that. But as an overview for this, because I don't want to be long-winded about it, let's just kind of go over the basics of it. So what we have is a display area here, and what you see in the display is a variety of things, including echoes, early reflections at the beginning, and the reverberant tail. Think of the reverb in the FIR, which stands for finite impulse response, as sort of a form of like reverberant clay that you can mold. So while it's not an actual sample of an existing space, it's not taking on, you don't have to load in libraries and mega gig of like all kinds of impulse response samples of acoustic spaces. What you're doing is you're getting something that you can sort of morph into any shape that you want. And probably the quickest way to go about using a plugin like this and understanding a bit of it is to open up the main display and then just load up the huge library of presets. So you got halls, chambers, rooms, plates, big spaces, etc. There are, all different kinds of things that are in here, unnatural effects. In the hardware section, you can go through some very popular reverb programs, and what they've done is they've matched up the sounds of classic reverbs, like stuff from the 480L, PCM 70, PCM 80, 224, 990, which I want to say that's a Sony reverb. Maybe I'm wrong about that. And et cetera, including, so you really can get a lot of things while it's not necessarily giving you exactly, like I think this is the RMX 16. It's not giving you, the exact or those samples from those components, but what you're doing is you're getting a whole lot of stuff to play with it that actually works very similarly, except for you can morph it in ways that you can't even come close to on the original hardware, and that's kind of where it is. There's also, you also get a lot of presets that were created by different engineers that are going throughout. These are some of my presets that I stored. And then you got some other reverbs here. So when we call up a default reverb, what you got is a plugin window here. And from here, you have these different settings which you can adjust or calibrate or kind of move around. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to shut off my input and output echoes. And I'm going to zoom in right to the beginning here. So I got a little slider here that allows me to zoom in, and I could start off with my early reflections here. So if I'm trying to set up a reverb or set up a reverb sound with this, generally one quick way to kind of get started is like, let's just say we were looking for, just kind of a snare reverb. So what I would do here is I'm just going to send this off into a bus. And let's just kind of start with a simple, snare. I can start with my early reflections, and one thing I might want to do is just start by setting up a size for the early reflections. So this is like, the early reflections are the first reflections off the wall, and And what I can do is it starts off in a medium setting here. I have up to 10 different options here. So if I start with this setting, it's going to sound a bit shorter for a larger size room. And as I go through, they'll kind of get progressively a little bit bigger sounding. So depending upon what it is that you're looking for, you can get a variety of different sounds, and you could set your size according to how big you want to make the space work. Now, from here, you can start by swinging out of the early reflections and bringing in some of the reverb. I find that this is like a better way to start and set up a reverb, almost any type of reverb. Start with the early reflections, because that will sort of define the size of the space that you want, and then the reverb will naturally kind of fit in. So this actually has some equalization on it, so I'll try to kind of take out anything that I kind of see here along the way, and then we'll kind of go through. So you could hear like that EQ, how that kind of tones down, but still like a really, natural sounding reverb. Now from here I can drag this down and I can shorten the reverb time. And if I want to change the shape of it, then I can change some of the characteristics here by moving some of these guys, right? So if I take this, I can change like how. So you could hear how it sort of stays higher level and then just sort of rapidly drops off. Whereas if I move a little bit more this way, it's going to sound a little shorter and have a different decay characteristic. So I can actually shape the way I want the reverb to work. Very powerful. When you get into I'm not sure if I just did something weird. No. Okay. So now I'm going to, I scrolled the display. So you can scroll the display here. So let me kind of zoom in here a little bit and get back here. There's also a pre-delay. The pre-delay can sync to delay times, but otherwise I can move it just right from the beginning. If I do it this way, and you could get like, sync it in time, which is kind of cool because you don't normally get pre-delay with sync values, which is kind of cool, but a very common thing. And so I can keep this, but I can also do the up shape, right? So almost like a reverse thing or an inverted kind of thing. So this becomes a very powerful thing because, I can, there's one way to just, here, I'll just kind of zoom out here. I can sort of semi-create a reverse which, this is crazy and it's not the way to do it, but generally the way to do it. But what I can do here is I can actually work with this just to kind of to shape the way that it kind of moves in. And that could be really cool when you're working with something like a vocal or something like that. Now, if I want a reverse thing, I could just hit the reverse button. And then I would set my delay time according to, how long, of a delay might match up or a reverse timing. And that's almost by accident that I got to that number because I didn't plan it. But what's really cool is it doesn't mess up any of the other settings. There's also a test button here that sends a test signal feed in so you could just sort of hear the reverb and get a sense for like, overall what it is. I find that for the most part, you're going to want to set it up based on the sound that you have coming in. Now, when you actually work with this, there's loads of ways. You got the normal EQ stuff, reverb EQ, and then there's a filter on the early reflections. So you can shape the early reflections in addition to this. You got the balance control. You got a wet dry if you place it on an insert. You got an output gain control, pretty straightforward. Size control we already went over. The build-up and the pre-delay. The build-up is actually that first dot, but then you can shape how the reverb overall the characteristic shape of it. And there's nothing else I've seen that does that. Like the IR1 is really cool in that you can add in breakpoints on the IR1 and kind of shape the existing envelope of it. But with this, you're just sort of working again with this sort of reverberant clay that you can really shape and mold into whatever, kind of figure you want. What's really cool about this is that I can also set characteristics like compression. So here I can actually set this to compress with a separate recovery time. So here it's set to 300 milliseconds, which just by chance happens to be an eighth note. So all right, so let's. So this is like a compressor that's built in. And with the most important control, which is the recovery, which is really, really cool. You could also put in a ducting. And so what that does is if you have like a vocal, you can have some kind of crazy reverb, but it sort of ducks the level of the reverb until the vocal stops singing, and then it kind of raises up. Or you could de-ess it. And what it does is it puts in a heavy de-essing so that you can feed a vocal into a reverb and you don't get the signal shooting like right through. And I could do so many examples of each of these things. It would just kind of take forever. But you have all of those controls. And that's why I did the long form video and why it's 54 minutes. Going through some of the other sections, this is a really cool section right here. And what this does is it actually, you just have the reverb dampening right here. So that's kind of like a normal standard thing. You could also do an envelope kind of thing. And then I could select different types of filters. And then what I can do is I can set like a Q, and I can basically have a filter, and it goes between two frequencies. I have a start frequency, which is down here, and then I have an ending frequency, so I can kind of scale that to whatever numbers that I want. And maybe if I just sort of zoom in a little bit, that might make it a little bit easier to see. And which is really fun, because you can do really cool effects. That's really cool when you have like reverse effects. And this is like just something that you can, you could do it more subtle by narrowing the Q or by, doing it. And then you got high pass and low pass filters here, which is kind of fun. So you could kind of play with it from that perspective. There's also an LFO here, which allows you to just do a similar thing, but more in a sine wave kind of movement. So you could do this. You can sync it up to the tempo and set the timing. So then you could kind of play with the things from that level. So you could see there, just rather than having it instead of just having reverberant time based on each individual, for frequency, like you have with the dampening, you can also put in some other more interesting elements, like the envelope or the LFO sweeps. It also has an amplitude modulation section and a frequency modulation. This is like a kind of chorus effect. Here, if you have this, so like sort of chorused and flanged kind of reverb, and it'll have different settings. You also have an amplitude modulation, and what this allows you to do is it allows you to create some variation in the tail. So maybe if I take this off, so maybe the variation of this will probably come out more with a longer reverb time. So I could kind of scale. It's meant to create some variation in the tail here, so I'm not sure this is... So it has like almost like a little bit more of a slapback kind of characteristic here. And let's go back to our reverb time there, which seemed to work pretty well. Let's kind of take that off and also move on to some things here. This is kind of cool because you have an analog section, which is more like an overdriving the input. Oh, you actually have a drive control, which is like overdriving the input of an analog device. So it's almost like a distortion characteristic. You can also do some bit crunching. Makes it a little more lo-fi. Vintage. And then the analog just gives it a kind of warming characteristic. You can also work with the tempo here. This is really important when you're working with the input echoes and the output echoes, because when you work with this, it's you could change the tempo to increase the delay times on the input echoes, the taps. So we'll kind of get into some of that. So you can already see how powerful this is. We got the decay envelope. The input echoes takes the input signal and feeds it into the reverb delayed. And so you see these delays here. You get the discrete delay, which you could put in, or the diffuse delay, which is just the reverb. So I can... So I can have that feeding into the reverb. And so you have a series of different tap sizes and strengths, and that's just a straight eighth. So you can get like a little bit of a ghosting or an echo, and you can make that more dominant by bringing, that in more. It's like it was overdriving a little bit there. And then you also have output echoes. Output echoes are different because it's the output of the reverb fed back in. And so you're delaying the output of the reverb, and then you're restarting it at these different timings. So you can get the overall amount of them, the size, which increases or decreases the length, and the tonal character, which switches from more low frequency to higher frequency tonal quality. And that adds layers onto what's going on here. So between all of these different sections, you get just like a ridiculous amount of control over how to work with it. And these aren't all the best examples. If you want to see like more like musical examples with a lot of other things than just a snare drum, I just did this because it's the most easy thing to just demonstrate and show you, and you can hear the reverb and what some of the different sections do. Then watch the YouTube video that I created for Waves on the Waves channel. I think I've also posted it on my own YouTube channel, MPG Insider. And that video, much longer, will get into much more detail in different effects that I set up for different instruments. And you'll see me demonstrate the individual sections so you can get that. Really, really like ridiculously amazing plugin. There's nothing even remotely like this out there. And just because of the depth and breadth of control that you have over all of the individual elements of the actual sound, and the way that they sort of set up the sort of generic reverberant impulse response sample that you kind of work with. It's not generic at all, but it's really powerful because it allows you all these tools to really shape it. It's an awesome plugin, and definitely one that's at very least worth checking out. You got to use this. Some people have asked whether this sort of replaces impulse response reverbs or replaces other types of reverbs, and I'm not even sure I could kind of define it that way because everybody might have different needs or different purposes for things. But it's an incredibly powerful plugin, and on that video I show you, I think 12 or 14 different examples of completely different ways of using that plugin. So it's you can really see how powerful it is. So amazing one. Really great plugin. Hard to even do a short demonstration of it. The H Reverb plugin by Waves.